concealment by a mortgage lender and its executives of its deteriorating business models and increasingly risky mortgage lending practices. Inflated valuations of commercial and residential mortgage-backed securities by a mutual fund, and selective disclosure to favored investors that write-downs in that fund were imminent, thus allowing them to sell ahead of others and avoid losses. And insider trading using credit default swaps to illegally profit from material non-public information about an upcoming leveraged buyout. In addition, in this past fiscal year, as compared to last year, the SEC has increased disgorgement orders by 170%, penalty orders by 35%, emergency restraining orders by 82%, asset freezes by 78%, and we have returned approximately $6.6 billion to injured investors since the 2002 passage of the Sarbanes-Oxley Act. In all of these efforts, we have coordinated our enforcement efforts closely with other law enforcement agencies, and the task force will further invigorate our collective efforts. The SEC is proud to participate as a member of the task force, and I commend the Attorney General for his efforts in leading this important initiative. I'm now pleased to introduce Secretary Geithner.
Thank you, Rob, and my compliments to the Attorney General, to our colleagues at Justice and Treasury for bringing this together, and for our counterparts, our colleagues across the supervisory regulatory community. Just a few concluding remarks about the broader context. We're now just starting to emerge from a severe financial crisis, a deep recession caused in part by failures of financial regulation and consumer and investor protection. The basic safeguards in our financial system designed to provide these protections allowed institutions to operate outside of them with limited supervision and oversight. Financial institutions were allowed to shop for the weakest regulator and the weakest form of regulation. This helped make it possible for millions of Americans to be sold subprime mortgages they couldn't afford, for institutions to compete in the credit space, consumer credit products, in trying to find ways to extract greater fees from consumers rather than competing to provide simple products with clear disclosure, basic protections. And they help make it possible for financial criminals to defraud huge numbers of investors of their savings. Now, to address these failures, we need to enact comprehensive financial reforms that establish stronger standards of protection, enforces those standards more evenly, and creates a more stable and safer financial system. The bills now working their way through both chambers of Congress would do that by laying in place much stronger system-wide protections for consumers and investors. But for these reforms to work, we need a much more aggressive strategy of enforcement. It's not enough to go after fraud after it's become widespread. We can't wait for problems before we respond. Too often in the past, even with enormously dedicated people working very hard at the federal and state level, enforcement resources were not mobilized on a major scale until extensive damage had already been done. Just remember, it took the federal banking agencies until June 2007 to reach a consensus on broad standards for subprime mortgages. By then it was too late. President Obama is committed to bringing a more aggressive, a more preemptive, a more proactive approach across federal agencies alongside state governments to stop trends in financial fraud as early as possible, and this task force is designed to do that. Now, as you heard lay out in the mortgage fraud area, a bunch of other areas, we've already taken some important steps in that direction. You're seeing coordination and cooperation result in early action to close down these fraud companies engaged in mortgage fraud and broad consumer credit fraud. Now, Treasury is going to play a key role in this task force. As part of this, we're going to help make sure we increase transparency, making it more difficult to criminals to access the payment system, to hide their ownership in companies, to hide illegal assets. And we're going to help promote greater cooperation to better analyze and investigate the intelligence we get from financial institutions regarding suspicious activities. Now, if you look back 2 years ago, the conventional wisdom in parts of our financial system was that the system was burdened by too many rules and too much enforcement. But that consensus was wrong. We need to do everything we can to help restore trust and confidence in our system, and central to that effort is enacting stronger and smarter rules with much stronger and much more proactive enforcement. Thank you very much.
Attorney
Attorney General, could you explain how the Financial Fraud Task Force will be different from the Corporate Fraud Task Force? And was there something that wasn't happening before that requires a new task force with a different name?
Well, I think, excuse me, I think what you have here is a greater effort at coordinating the various agencies on the federal level as well as the state and local levels to handle the problems that we are confronting. The fact that you have just the heads of federal agencies here today is not an indication of the breadth of this effort. We have been talking to the state attorneys general who will be a part of this. We've been speaking to district attorneys who will be a part of this effort as well. The problem we face, I think, is actually in some ways broader than that was faced by the previous task force, and that is why this effort is larger in scope.
Secretary Geithner, in your opening comments, you said we're just beginning to emerge from a severe financial crisis. I'm wondering, Chairman Bernanke said yesterday that the dollar's decline is because of a reversal of the flight to quality. Do you think that we are now sort of out of the woods there on that? We're going to return to a fundamentals on the dollar's value? And secondly, it was Inspector General on AIG, which had an unflattering light, painted you in an unflattering light. Do you think you got a fair shake on that?
I don't generally talk about markets, and I've never had the chance to do it in the halls of the Justice Department.
Now I get to do it at the Justice Department as well. Unfortunately, that's part of
I would say, it's very important to note that the economy is growing again. You need growth to help bring down unemployment. It's the beginnings of recovery. A lot of challenge out there. It's a very tough economic environment, but the financial system is much more stable, and you're seeing really very substantial improvements across the economy in terms of access to credit, falling costs of credit, and that's very important. We want to make sure we're reinforcing that basic progress. And these improvements came in significant part because you saw countries around the world acting very, very aggressively to help confront, which was the worst crisis in generations. And I think we're very encouraged by the signs we're seeing, but it's a very tough, challenging environment out there. Your second question was about the SIGTARP report. Yeah. Look, it's a great strength of our country that you're going to have the chance for a range of people to look back at every decision made at every stage in this crisis and look at the quality of judgments made and evaluate them with the benefit of hindsight. Now, you're going to see a lot of conviction in this, a lot of strong views, a lot of it untainted by experience. But it's a good strength of our country that people are willing to take a careful, independent, hard look at these things. The most important thing to understand about this, and this was a tragic failure of our country, is that we came into this crisis without the basic set of tools we needed to help contain the damage caused by hugely costly mistakes in parts of our financial system. And that's why the President is working so hard with the leadership of Congress to try to make sure we have in place a set of tools and rules and procedures to make sure that we can manage the failure, not rescue, but manage the failure of large, complex institutions with less damage to the economy and less risk to the taxpayer. And I am very encouraged by the broad consensus you're seeing across the Hill in support of a stronger set of tools for doing that, and very hopeful that we're going to have those in place, and they will be the laws of the land relatively soon. Thank you.
Where do you see those rules relative to this task force, given that, as my colleague said, the task force is essentially a renaming of an existing structure?
Well, again, you need not just smarter, basic rules of the game with cleaner oversight, without huge opportunities to evade those rules, but you need much more effective deterrence through the careful, more active mobilization of enforcement resources earlier. That's very hard to do, but it requires connecting the dots more clearly and make sure you have to bring all the resources of the federal government together to try to identify these practices before they become pervasive enough they can do a lot of damage. And that's something we're going to work very hard at, and we're committed to do a better job of that in the future.
Mr. Attorney General, the previous administration said the Corporate Fraud Task Force was looking specifically at Wall Street firms, the biggest Wall Street firms. By replacing it, are you saying that the Justice Department did not find a great deal of fraud on Wall Street, or did not find enough fraud to continue the Corporate Task Force?
I'm not saying that at all. The investigations that were underway continue. There are new investigations that have been launched. Obviously can't talk about anything that is ongoing. But our focus is on all the places where we find or possibly can find fraud, whether it's on Wall Street, in the housing industry, the full breadth of those activities that led to, at least in part, helped to bring about the financial crisis that we are dealing with is the scope of this task force.
Mr. Attorney General, if I could ask you about the 9/11 case. On Friday, you had the announcement, and in that announcement you had referenced previous terrorism cases that the Justice Department has prosecuted successfully. Some people say that those cases are very unlike this case. I'm wondering what you think those cases, what you're going to be able to take from those cases that makes you believe that this will be a successful case. And related to that, in making your decision, what rules of evidence issues did you look at as part of your analysis to come to this conclusion?
Well, in making the decision that I made, I'm obviously cognizant of what we have done in the past, but focused really on what we're going to have to do in the future, and focused on the cases that had been developed by the prosecutors from the Justice Department, from the Department of Defense, applied my 30-something years of experience as a prosecutor, and as I said then, and I say again, I'm confident that we are going to be successful in the outcome, and I base that on my review of the facts, the evidence, the law that will apply, and the confidence that I have in the great prosecutors who will handle the case.
Can you talk about the rules of evidence and specifically what type of analysis or issues you looked at before coming to your final decision?
I mean, I looked at a variety of things about the questions of admissibility of evidence, what evidence could be admitted in the various forms, that is a military commission as opposed to an Article III court, what problems we might have with regard to getting witnesses here. I mean, the whole variety of things that we considered, and in making those judgments, in calculating all of those considerations, I made the determination that the best place for the cases was where I placed them.
Mr. Holder, can you address the government just recently lost the Bear Stearns case in Brooklyn. What might this task force, what kind of difference might that have made with that case, or can you provide any commentary on that?
Well, obviously we respect the verdict that was returned in those cases, and we analyze cases like that and learn from them, and that analysis is underway. We'll try to determine exactly why we were not successful there, and determine what mistakes might have been made, and so we don't repeat those in the future. But that should not be seen in any way as something that's going to deter us from being very forceful in going after the kinds of fraud that we alleged occurred in those cases.
Do you believe that there was actual you've mentioned Wall Street several times, that there was criminal intent going on at some of the major institutions? In February, the FBI said there were 38 firms related to the current financial crisis under investigation, yet the Bear Stearns case was the only one that was brought. In June, the SEC brought a case against Countrywide, yet the Justice Department didn't bring any charges at the same time, and it's still been some time since then. Do you believe there was actual criminal conduct going on there based on what you know?
Well, there are ongoing investigations, and we will, when we think appropriate, make determinations and reveal those determinations to the public. I can just say at this point that the Criminal Division, in conjunction with the various U.S. Attorney's offices, has under investigation a number of matters.
General Holder, several of you described cases that have been prosecuted, financial crimes that have been prosecuted. What's the difference between how they'll be investigated and prosecuted under this incarnation of the task force versus how they were investigated and prosecuted before this task force?
Well, I mean, in terms of how they will be prosecuted, there will be people, there's going to be a great deal of similarity. A prosecutor will stand up in front of a judge and there'll be a jury in the box. All right, there is that, I'll concede that. But the breadth of what we're going to be looking at, I think, is different from what occurred before. We're talking about, I mean, we have here the SEC, the Treasury Department, the Department of Housing and Urban Development, along with people at the state and local levels. We're looking at mortgage fraud, financial fraud, all forms of fraud that have occurred and that we are bound and determined to prevent from happening in the future. And I think that is the thing that is different, the breadth of what is the responsibility of this task force.
Mr. Holder? Yesterday, there was a task force was dispatched to a prison in Illinois to see whether it would be suitable to hold federal prisoners. What have you been told about that, and when do you think some decision will be made about whether it's appropriate and suitable for detainees?
I've not actually spoken to anybody who